to breathe is to weep. I read an experience from the life of Cecil DeMille that you'll recognize, of course, as the famous movie producer, known for a cast of millions in his movies, including The Ten Commandments. Cecil DeMille was a very thoughtful man, and one day when he was greatly troubled by something and went off by himself into the woods, he went to a pond that he was familiar with, got into a canoe that was there, allowed the wind to push the canoe where it would, and eventually ran aground in the most shallow part of the pond, just inches of water. Cecil DeMille looked over the side of the canoe and he noticed on the bottom of the pond there were thousands of water beetles. And as he looked, one of the water beetles surfaced, crawled up the side of the canoe, attached its legs to the top of the canoe, the gunwale, and sat there in the sunshine. Cecil DeMille sat there for several hours. He had forgotten about the beetle. But then he looked back and he noticed that in the sunshine the water beetle's shell had split. And from that shell there came a beautiful brand new creature, a dragonfly. It sat there and its wings dried and became strong enough that it could take flight. And Cecil DeMille said this about the experience. That winged insect flew farther in an instant than the water beetle had crawled in days. In fact, further than it had crawled in all of its life. Then it circled back and swooped down to the surface of the water. DeMille noticed its shadow on the water, and the water beetles below might have seen it too. But now their erstwhile companion was in a world beyond their comprehension. They were still living in their limited beetle world, while their winged cousin had gained for himself all of the freedom between earth and sky. DeMille commented about that and simply said, God would do that for a water beetle? I'm convinced that babies in a world that you and I cannot fully understand because we're still living in our limited beetle world. And we don't understand much about that other world that God has promised. The Bible does say in Revelation 21 that the streets of God's heaven are paved with pure gold, which tells me that what we count most valuable down here, gold, just something to pave the streets with up there. I remember when baby would run circles in Emma's house and in our house. And I mean, she could go at a speed that you could hardly imagine as she would run from one room to the other and always find something to circle as the point at which to turn back. She was like a NASCAR racer, except she did both right and left turns. And I'm convinced at the moment she's having some trouble because making those turns on streets of pure gold would be a difficult sign. But if any critter can do it, I'm also convinced it is baby that can. And by the way, if ever anyone has sneaked up on the gates of heaven, it shall not happen again. Because baby's barking will alert Peter and anyone else who needs to be alerted that someone is approaching. No one could get close to the house without baby's announcement of their approach long before we had any idea. Another familiar name for us is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin experienced the tragedy of the death of his brother John. And there was a member of the family who was grieving beyond being consoled. And Ben Franklin wrote a letter to that family member who was grieving so. And in part the letter said this, that bodies should be lent us while they can afford us pleasure, assist us in acquiring knowledge, or doing good to our fellow creatures, is a kind and benevolent act of God. When they become unfit for those purposes and afford us pain instead of pleasure, instead of an aid become an encumbrance and answer none of the intentions for which they were given, it is equally kind and benevolent that a way is provided by which we may be relieved of those bodies. Death is that way. Our friend and we are invited aboard a party of pleasure which is to last forever. His chair was ready first, and he has gone before us. We could not all conveniently start together, and why should you and I be grieved at this, since we are soon to follow and know where to find him? I'm convinced that the Lord in His grace, seeing that baby's body had worn out, she no longer could run those circles. We're fairly sure could no longer see and barely hear, was ready for a trade-in, for a new body, and God has granted that. Does not make it easy in this case or any like it for those of us who remain, but it is still an act of God's grace. And by His grace, when we next see baby and Bruce and others who have gone before, it shall be in a brand new body with none of the limitations that come our way as these bodies age. One last story. When Nancy and I moved to Kentucky to go to seminary, a pastor of a neighboring church very close to the seminary campus was named John Claypool. Some of you have heard of him and perhaps have read his books. If you have not read his book, Tracts of a Pedal Struggler, you have missed, in my judgment, the best book on grief to be found. That book is a collection of 4 sermons.